to Rich Planet TV. I'm Richard D. Hall. Today I will be speaking to a familiar guest who is here to talk about a subject that we haven't yet covered in any great detail on Rich Planet, NASA's alleged missions to the Moon. Welcome, Andrew Johnson.
Thanks for inviting me back, Richard. Good to be here.
All right then, now recently Channel 5 screened a documentary all about this subject entitled Did We Land on the Moon? And throughout the programme it presented some of the evidence that people put forward to make the argument that they didn't land on the moon, but at the very end, and left it right to the end, it said, oh well, we can ignore all that because there's some fairly recent photographs of craft which have overflown the moon, lunar orbiter type craft, which has taken photographs of all of the remnants of the Apollo landers and all the rest of it. Now we're going to go over some of that evidence and a whole lot of other evidence which may not have been in the Channel 5 documentary, because just to give my sort of angle on this, if you like, it's a bit of a diversionary argument in my opinion. Did we land on the moon? Because when you get involved in that argument, did we land, did we not, did they go or not, what it does is it diverts you from two very, very important questions or facts. Firstly, is there more advanced technology than rocket technology that can go way beyond that in a secret space program? It diverts your mind from that. And secondly, it kind of makes you accept that the moon is completely inert and nothing's been there before now, if you like, or before 1969. And I also question that. So to me, it's what I would call a phony bone of contention. Contention is brought around something which diverts your mind from elsewhere, because I'm fairly convinced there is a secret space program with craft that make the Apollo and the Space Shuttle missions look, frankly, toy-like.
I would agree. Yes, I would agree with that.
And I actually it annoys me because people often say to me, Richard, have you been to the Kennedy Space Center? That's what they'll say. And they'll eulogize about going there. Oh, it's absolutely phenomenal. The technology there is amazing. Richard, you must go to the Kennedy Space Center. And I laugh at them and I say, what? You mean a firework? Because
yes.
That's what allegedly got us to the moon.
I think that just to add on to that a little bit. I mean, here we are, two engineers, who looked at the Apollo program perhaps in their youth, and I've said this to people. I looked at the Apollo program in my youth, and I was inspired by it. I thought how fantastic this is, how wonderful this technology is, and what an achievement it is that we've sent these people to the moon, and here we are, so many years later, questioning all of that. And I think that's also one of the keys, that we must be willing to question these things, even though we may be convinced, like you say, of the chap that said go to the Kennedy Space Center. We've got to be able to question whether what we're being shown at the Kennedy Space Center is actually, the sort of real thing that it's meant to represent, or is it, as you say, part of this phony bone of contention or a diversionary thing to divert our attention away from something else, bizarre though that seems.
Now what makes me suspect there are far more exotic types of propulsion are whistleblowers such as Stan Deyo, Edward Teller's alleged involvement in a secret group that were it was disclosed in the 1950s that they were looking at anti-gravity technology,
right,
which went into the black in round about 56, 57.
That's right. I mean, again, read Nick Cook's book Hunt for Zero Point, where he talks about that, and he mentions Project Winterhaven, which is Thomas Townsend Brown's work, and it appears that was the Thomas Townsend Brown work, which I believe you may be covering more in a future programme, hopefully. That went into the black. That's what Nick Cook, who's a defence journalist, suggests. And so there does seem to be some tie-in with the timing that all the major US airspace corporations were looking at anti-gravity as some type of workable technology, or developing that as a workable technology up until about 1956, and then it was like, oh no, that's ridiculous. We can't do that. Almost an overnight change, as Nick Cook documents.
Right. Now, in my upcoming series of lectures in May this year, I will be looking at one of the alleged forms of alternative propulsion, which in my opinion just completely transcend the rocket-based putting explosives in a tube and setting fire to it. that's the extent of our supposed technology which has gotten us into space and to the moon. And I contend there's a far more advanced form of propulsion available that they've kept secret. Now, I'm actually open-minded on whether the rocket-based technology landed on the moon or not. And Andrew's presented me with a lot of evidence, because he contends that at least the rocket-based Apollo program never landed on the moon. That's what you would contend.
I would conclude from what I've looked at, yes, that cannot have taken place that way.
Okay, and we're going to look now, now that we've sort of set the scene, that we're not saying that we've not been into space. Right. We think there could be something major which has been kept under wraps. But we're going to look at the rocket-based systems, let's say, and ask the questions whether they could have got to the moon's surface and back. Now, Andrew's looked at this subject in a lot of detail over the years, and you're going to put forward your argument. Now, where do you want to start, Andrew?
I usually start by discussing the pedigree, what I call the pedigree of the Apollo program, really. And it's fairly common knowledge that a lot of the NASA rocket scientists were drawn from Nazi Germany. Mm-hmm. And we have the so-called paperclips conspiracy. That's the name given to it, and that was actually revealed to me for the first time in the 1980s in a BBC Horizon documentary, where it actually explained that these scientists were brought over at the end of the Second World War, following things like the V2 program, which launched all those rockets to London and so on. And it was Wernher von Braun.
And these were supersonic, which meant that you couldn't actually hear them.
Well, yes, I suppose that's true. I wasn't really thinking of that, but yes, that was...
Apparently in London,
yes.
In the Blitz, people feared them because a supersonic rocket, you can't hear it coming because it's travelling faster than sound. So it would just go off. Whereas your classic Second World War bomb is a... and then you get a chance to run for cover. But that was why people feared them, apparently, in London. Although I don't think they were that accurate, and I don't think they killed a lot of people.
I mean, there were a lot of problems they had to solve, getting them up in the air, the guidance systems, and so on. Mm-hmm. So there was a lot of technology involved at that time. Mm-hmm. And it was Wernher von Braun who was apparently the chief rocket scientist.
But we didn't have technology where you could fire a rocket from London and hit Germany. That technology didn't exist.
No.
But they did. They could fire rockets from Germany that would land on London.
Right. That is apparently the case.
Or they were developing that in the latter stages of the war.
Yeah. And the Doodlebug and the V2, as I say.
Right.
And then a lot of those scientists end up working in the States. Mm-hmm. And they obviously did a sort of brain drain from Nazi Germany, and they used it probably to build up their own military industrial complex. Mm-hmm. But then that kind of when the Soviets put up Sputnik in 1957, that seemed to be sort of the start of the space race, and the US then said, we've now got to get satellites because the Russians could bomb us from space. Mm-hmm. I guess that's the sort of psychology and mentality that they were using at that time. Mm-hmm. But then, so a lot of those scientists ended up as part of the NASA's rocketry development program. Mm-hmm. Chief among them, as I say, was Wernher von Braun, who worked for the Nazi regime. So we got this quote from Wernher von Braun. This is from his book, Conquest of the Moon. And he says, "It is commonly believed that man will fly directly from the Earth to the Moon, but to do this we would require a vehicle of such gigantic proportions that it would prove an economic impossibility. It would have to develop sufficient speed to penetrate the atmosphere and overcome the Earth's gravity, and having travelled all the way to the Moon, it must still have enough fuel to land safely and make the return trip to the Earth. Furthermore, in order to give the expedition a margin of safety, we would not use one ship alone, but a minimum of 3. Each rocket ship would be taller than New York's Empire State Building, almost a quarter of a mile high, and weigh about 10 times the tonnage of the Queen Mary, or some 800,000 tons." And you can see this clip in Apollo 0, which is a free online documentary where you'll see the cover of that book.
And that was 1953 made that statement?
I believe it was 53 that book came out.
This is a guy who can do all of the calculation with regards how much oxygen and hydrogen propulsion can produce, and he's worked out how much fuel is needed to get there and to get back using standard sort of calculations. And
Right. I mean, one of the key things, I understand it from what I know about rocket science, is delta V, the change in velocity, because at each manoeuvre you're going to change velocity in some way, either to speed up or to slow down or to turn a corner. And that's obviously when you use the fleet fuel. So you have to calculate all the changes in velocity that are going to occur, and then based on that, you know how much fuel you're going to use based on the mass of the vehicle that you're going to use.
Right. All right. Well, what about the fact that once you've at a fixed velocity heading towards your target in the moon, in space, you don't really need any additional fuel. You're just sort of freewheeling, if you like.
That's right. But then you need to slow down, don't you? When you come to the moon, you need to slow down.
Obviously,
in a controlled manner, and maybe in various stages. So each of those stages, you use up fuel.
Yeah. Okay. So what have you got for us next?
Well, and then you look at, for example, the history of the Apollo program. It's peppered with some very strange events. For example, most people are aware that 3 of the early astronauts were killed in a fire in the capsule, and one of these astronauts was Gus Grissom, and he was signed up early onto the Apollo program, and they started the training and so on, and they were working with sort of developmental rockets and capsules, and there's this clip of him talking, saying, how are we going to get to the moon if we can't even communicate between 3 buildings, when they weren't even able to talk from the capsule to one building to another. They couldn't do it because they messed up the wiring or the radio signals or whatever. Right. And he, after a few weeks or months, he became a critic and said that this program was in such a shambles that they were never going to make it to the moon. Right. And he thought, because Kennedy had done this with such fanfare, people needed to know about this. So he organised a press conference. And there's this story which is in this Apollo 0 movie, and it's also documented, that Gus Grissom went as far as taking a lemon from his lemon tree and putting it on a coat hanger and then hanging it on the Apollo capsule when he was going in for his latest sort of set of training, because this thing was a lemon. It was never going to work. It was never going to do its job. It was never going to fly. Right. And then, following that press conference by Gus Grissom, an inquiry was launched into the state of the Apollo program, and that was written up and it was presented to the appropriate part of the government as a review of the state of the Apollo program. And he was also very critical. He said they would never be able to do it by 1969. Right. And both of those people, the person who wrote the report and Gus Grissom, ended up dead. Gus Grissom in the fire, which his son Scott Grissom later asked for an inquiry into that event. Right. And what Scott Grissom uncovered was that it did seem that the capsule had been rigged for the fire to start. Right. He thinks the fire was started deliberately so that Gus Grissom. It does appear to me, and I would tend to agree, that Gus Grissom, because he was speaking out, they knew they wouldn't be able to help. They wouldn't be able to keep a lid on the Apollo program because he was an honest guy. He was going to speak out. So they killed him. So
you think he could have been murdered by NASA?
I think he was murdered in the Apollo 1 fire, along with Ed White, and I can't remember unfortunately the name of the third astronaut that died in that event.
All right. Now, what about a lot of evidence has been put forward, photographic and video evidence, because there's a lot of images allegedly taken on the moon, which I know a lot of people will pick fault with. Where do you stand on all of that evidence, Andrew?
Well, I think it's a bit of a mixed bag. I mean, I know Marcus Allen, for example, talks a lot about these images, and I've seen a couple of his presentations. They're very good.
Some notable ones, just off the top of my head. There's one where there's a rock on the surface of the moon, and it's got the number C written on it. So it looks like a prop. And other ones, such as one astronaut's shadow is twice the length of another astronaut's shadow, which suggests the light source is close to the astronauts, within so many feet. The sun couldn't possibly produce shadows of that length. Therefore, it's a floodlight which wasn't available.
There are arguments about the angle, the length, and direction of the shadows. But
that's not the evidence you
I don't focus on that because you can contest it. I mean, we've got this example. So one of the ones that comes up quite often with the shadow argument is the clip of Aldrin coming out of the lunar module, and it is claimed by the people who think the photographs are fake that the illumination of Aldrin cannot be real because the sun is behind the lunar module, and therefore Aldrin should be completely in shadow. and you would not be able to see him, but yet he's fairly well lit. But I saw quite an interesting simulation on a web page which I looked up, and basically what this chap did is to test this idea that Aldrin should have been in shadow. He set up a spotlight and shone it onto a tennis court, which is quite close, an asphalt tennis court, not a grass one, quite close in colour to the lunar surface, very dark. And he set up some tin cans on the ground, and you can see here, which will show this slide, you can see that he was able to see the dark side away from the light source quite well in shadow. So to me, although that photograph still could be fake, I don't think it's conclusive. You can contest this idea that shadows would have completely obscured Aldrin, because in this simulation of that same situation, you can see the dark side of the object, what would be in the shadow. So I don't think those arguments, are conclusive. I think they're testable.
Right. Now, there's people also suggest, and I think you've got another slide that might back this up, that Stanley Kubrick, who had been making the film, was it 2001: A Space Odyssey, around that time, that NASA used some of his sets, and in particular a technique that he used which was ahead of its time then, it was a front projection screen system.
Right.
What that did, it would allow you to use a screen to put a background on a foreground sort of thing. If
we take it that the photographs were faked, well, who faked them? Did they have some specialist unit to do it, or did they invite or otherwise get somebody like Stanley Kubrick to do it? And when we discussed this and people said this to me a few years ago, I thought, that's just nonsense, that's just ridiculous. There's how are you ever going to, prove that? It's just ridiculous. But there is a very interesting documentary made by Jay Wiedner called Kubrick's Odyssey, which, as you just mentioned there, looks at the front projection system, and then looks at some of the shots from the film 2001, Kubrick's space film, which coincidentally came out in 1968, which was the year before the moon landing, or the alleged moon landing. And it appears that if you look at the history of 2001, it did, the development of that film paralleled the development of the Apollo program. And even Jay Wiedner points out that one of the scientists who was consulting with NASA on the Apollo program also works as a consultant on 2001. I mean, that doesn't really, he's probably just a good space scientist. It doesn't really prove anything. Right. But we have a couple of images of interest, in particular, which I think do possibly illustrate this front projection technique where it's been used. And this is one that's been put together by David Percy, and I've just made an animated version of it.
This is a NASA photograph. Yeah.
This is the Apollo 17 mission. So what we've got here is we have two pictures taken supposedly at different times on the same mission, both Apollo 17, and we see that in one shot we see a large lunar module quite close to it, maybe, 20 feet away or something, and then in another shot we see an astronaut in the foreground, and we see the lunar module over to the right in the distance, maybe 300-400 yards away, something like that. But when you overlay these two sets of images, you can see that the backdrop is identical. The field within the backdrop is absolutely identical.
So there's no way the lunar module would move from there over to there, where it is.
How would it? It would have to take off and land again if that's indeed what had happened, which is clearly ridiculous.
So that's a fake background.
I think that this indicates that Jay Wiedner is right, and what we're seeing, this line here, is the edge of the stage, and we've got the front projection in the backdrop.
Right. And Wiedner does demonstrate. He draws a line on a lot of the NASA images, saying, right, that's the end of the set, and that's where the
screen is.
That's where the screen starts.
Yeah. So I mean, I think
that's the giveaway in this front projection screen system.
Right.
You always have a border or a line where the set ends and the screen starts, and it's that line that you can sometimes identify because the texture of the set will be slightly different to the texture of the artificial background.
Correct. They can't quite match up the
Right.
you know the details of it, and I think that is, I would get, you know, to me, that I think that is what we're seeing in this picture. You can see just below the hill there, we've got that front projection line going right across from right to left.
And of course, this is quite a late mission. What,
Yeah.
Apollo 17?
17,
So
yeah.
what year we're talking? Early 70s?
That would have been early 70s, I think. Yeah, again, I don't know all the dates of all the missions,
All right.
and people have criticised me because I don't know all the Apollo statistics, you know, and so on. But
All right, Andrew. Well, we'll talk more after this break.